Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The American reconnaissance patrols, pushing eastward into the snow-dusted, silent woods, encountered what they initially dismissed as the last broken fragments of a defeated Wehrmacht. This casual assessment, born of months of relentless Allied advance and the perceived collapse of German resistance, would prove a dangerous miscalculation, directly leading to the inexplicable disappearance of vital materiel and a critical erosion of forward intelligence capabilities. Sergeant Frank Miller, a veteran scout with the 84th Infantry Division's reconnaissance troop, led his three-man jeep crew along a narrow logging track, the vehicle's tires crunching on frozen leaves. His unit's mission was to probe the forward edge of the perceived German withdrawal, identifying any lingering pockets of resistance. Their initial reports, radioed back to company command, spoke of disorganized stragglers, often elderly men or young boys, poorly equipped and seemingly devoid of fighting spirit. Miller himself had observed a group of 5 Germans, their field gray uniforms threadbare, attempting to warm themselves by a meager fire, their expressions etched with fatigue rather than defiance. The first contact, on December 12th, involved a brief, almost perfunctory exchange of small arms fire near a cluster of abandoned farmhouses. Miller's patrol, equipped with M1 Garens and a Browning automatic rifle, quickly suppressed the German position, capturing 3 prisoners. Interrogation files later confirmed these individuals were indeed reservists, hastily conscripted, armed with bolt-action Kar-98K rifles and carrying minimal rations. Their average age was 47. The prisoners offered no tactical intelligence of value, speaking only of a desire to return home. Over the next 48 hours, similar encounters unfolded across a 30-kilometer front. Unit diaries from the 84th and elements of the 106th Infantry Divisions recorded 23 such skirmishes, resulting in 78 German prisoners and an estimated 35 enemy killed. The common thread in these reports was the low combat effectiveness of the German forces encountered. American units consistently outmaneuvered and overwhelmed them, often with minimal casualties. The prevailing sentiment among the forward reconnaissance troops, as documented in after-action reports, was one of almost contemptuous pity for these old Panzergrenadiers, a term used with derision rather than accuracy. This perception of a collapsing, decrepit enemy was further reinforced by the sheer volume of abandoned equipment. Rusted machine guns, half-tracked vehicles with blown engines, and supply wagons left by the roadside. The logistical strain on the German army was evident in every discarded boot and empty ammunition crate. American intelligence officers, reviewing these findings, concluded that the Ardennes sector was indeed being held by a skeletal force, awaiting the inevitable Allied advance. The strategic implication was clear. The main German defenses lay further east, and the current opposition was merely a delaying screen, easily brushed aside. Yet, within this pattern of predictable, easy victories, a subtle anomaly began to emerge. On the night of December 14th, 2 jeeps from the 84th Reconnaissance Troop, parked just 500 meters behind the forward line of patrols, vanished without a trace. Their drivers, assigned to guard duty, were also gone. There was no sound of a struggle, no spent casings, no disturbed snow to indicate a fight. The only evidence left behind was a single, neatly folded American flag, placed precisely where one of the jeeps had stood. The initial reports filtering back to the American command posts painted a picture of an enemy far removed from the formidable Wehrmacht of earlier campaigns. These were not the young, fanatical SS divisions or the seasoned armored spearheads that had carved through Europe. Instead, recon patrols consistently encountered what they described as old men and boys, units characterized by a noticeable lack of modern equipment and a seemingly disoriented posture. Unit diaries and after-action summaries from the early days of engagement frequently remarked on the advanced age of many German prisoners. some well into their 50s, others barely out of their teens. Equipment manifests, captured from these formations, often listed a preponderance of older model rifles, a scattering of pre-war machine guns, and a distinct absence of the more formidable anti-tank weapons that had defined German defensive capabilities. The impression solidified. These were the remnants, the last levies scraped from an exhausted nation. Interrogation files from the 82nd Airborne Division, for example, detailed the accounts of captured German grenadiers, many of whom spoke openly of their lack of training and the hurried nature of their deployment. One prisoner, a former Baker conscripted just weeks prior, described receiving only rudimentary instruction on his Mauser K98 rifle. His unit, the 275th Infantry Division, was largely composed of men previously deemed unfit for frontline service, or those recalled from occupational duties in quieter sectors. The tactical implications of these observations were profound. American planners, already confident in their air superiority and overwhelming logistical advantage, began to view these German formations as little more than a delaying force, a speed bump on the road to deeper objectives. The perceived weakness of the enemy fostered a growing sense of complacency within forward elements, particularly among the highly mobile reconnaissance units. Their operational tempo, already aggressive, became even bolder, pushing deeper with less caution. This evolving perception of the enemy, documented in numerous intelligence summaries, led to a subtle but significant shift in operational doctrine for the American recon elements. The emphasis moved from cautious probing and detailed intelligence gathering to swift, almost cavalier, advances. The belief that these old Panzergrenadiers posed little real threat encouraged a certain recklessness, a reduction in the meticulous security protocols that had previously governed their movements. The operational logs of the 3rd Armored Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, for instance, show a marked increase in the average distance covered by forward patrols without significant contact, rising from an average of 15 kilometers to over 30 kilometers in a single day. This extended reach, while seemingly efficient, often left these patrols isolated and reliant on their speed rather than robust defensive preparations. The prevailing sentiment was that any serious German resistance would be easily outmaneuvered or simply overrun. This psychological landscape, shaped by repeated encounters with seemingly inferior German forces, created a dangerous vulnerability. The American recon units, designed for speed and agility, now operated with an almost casual disregard for potential threats, their confidence bolstered by the consistent reports of an enemy in disarray. The stage was set for a stark reevaluation of their assumptions. Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The pervasive damp cold of the deep winter had settled in, a premonition of the brutal engagement to come. Yet for many American reconnaissance units, the immediate concern was a baffling series of disappearances. At first, it was isolated incidents, a jerry can of high-octane gasoline, then a crate of K rations, noted more as an annoyance than a threat. These were the petty pilferings of war, common enough, easily attributed to opportunistic locals or even American GIs themselves. The pattern, however, began to coalesce into something far more sinister than simple theft. On the night of December 14th, from the motor pool of the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion, 2 fully fueled Willys MB Jeeps vanished. The vehicles had been parked in a supposedly secure area, chained together and covered with tarpaulins, their ignition keys removed and stored in the company office. The next morning, only the severed chains remained, lying in the frozen mud. Unit diaries from the 82nd and neighboring 99th Infantry Divisions recorded similar, escalating losses. Over a 72-hour period between December 14th and 17th, a total of 14 Jeeps were reported missing across a 30-mile front, along with an estimated 3,000 gallons of fuel, 800 pounds of C4 explosive, and an undisclosed quantity of winter clothing. The disappearances were concentrated in sectors adjacent to known German lines, but crucially, there was no evidence of direct enemy engagement or infiltration. Perimeter guards reported nothing unusual, and snow tracks, where present, led away into the dense, silent woods, quickly obscured by fresh snowfall. The Willys MB, with its robust 60-horsepower engine and four-wheel drive, was an indispensable asset for reconnaissance, capable of traversing the rugged terrain of the Ardennes with relative ease. Its top speed of 65 miles per hour and a range of 300 miles on a single tank of fuel made it ideal for rapid movement and scouting missions. The loss of these vehicles represented a direct erosion of operational capability, forcing units to rely on less agile trucks or undertake longer, more exposed foot patrols. Interrogation files of captured German soldiers from this period initially yielded no intelligence regarding these specific losses, suggesting a clandestine operation rather than conventional raiding. The sheer audacity of the thefts, coupled with the lack of resistance or detection, pointed towards a highly organized and skilled adversary. The American command, initially dismissive, began to view the incidents not as isolated acts of opportunism, but as a systematic campaign designed to cripple their forward reconnaissance and logistical support. The psychological impact began to register, a creeping unease that something unseen was operating within their very perimeters. Normandy, August 1944. The initial American confidence, a byproduct of rapid advances and perceived German disorganization, began to erode with the persistent, almost surgical losses of reconnaissance assets. Field reports from the 3rd Armored Division, compiled between August 10th and August 15th, documented the disappearance of 14 jeeps and 3 M8 armored cars from forward reconnaissance patrols operating in the vicinity of Mortagne. These vehicles were not destroyed in direct engagements, nor were their crews typically found with them. Instead, they simply vanished, leaving behind only the tire tracks of their last known positions. Interrogation files from captured German soldiers, particularly those from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, started to paint a more coherent picture. One 48-year-old Unteroffizier, captured near Sordeval, described how his unit, often operating in small, camouflaged groups, would observe American patrol routes for days. Their tactics eschewed direct confrontation, focusing instead on ambush points where terrain offered concealment and escape routes. The objective was not always to kill the crew, but to disable the vehicle and, if possible, recover it for parts or intelligence. Analysis of these interrogation transcripts, cross-referenced with recovered American equipment logs, revealed a pattern. The German units, often composed of older, more experienced soldiers, were masters of infiltration and silent movement. They would cut communication lines, disable vehicles with shaped charges or well-placed rifle fire to engines, and then melt back into the hedgerows before reinforcements could arrive. The absence of large-scale firefights initially misled American commanders into believing these were isolated incidents of mechanical failure or desertion, rather than coordinated enemy action. The strategic implication of these losses extended beyond the mere attrition of vehicles. Each vanished jeep represented a blind spot, a gap in the intelligence network that American forces relied upon for rapid maneuver warfare. Without eyes forward, divisions became more cautious, their advances slowing as they allocated more resources to securing flanks and rear areas, a direct drain on combat power. The German objective, it became clear, was not to halt the American advance outright, but to harass, delay, and instill a pervasive sense of insecurity. The realization dawned slowly, a creeping understanding that the old Panzergrenadiers, initially dismissed as a collection of rearguard stragglers, were in fact a highly effective, stealthy threat. Their methods were unconventional, their targets precise, and their impact disproportionate to their numerical strength. The laughter had ceased. The German forces, initially dismissed as a spent force, were not engaging in direct confrontation, but rather a more insidious form of warfare. Their operations focused on infiltration, bypassing forward American positions to strike at vulnerable rear echelons. This strategy, honed in earlier campaigns, leveraged the dense European terrain and the overconfidence of the Allied advance. Unit diaries from the 106th Cavalry Group, for instance, began recording an increase in isolated ambushes on supply convoys and reconnaissance patrols. These were not large-scale engagements, but swift, brutal attacks executed with precision. The enemy's objective was not to hold ground, but to disrupt, demoralize, and extract vital resources. Interrogation files from captured German soldiers, primarily from the 116th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, revealed a consistent pattern. Small, highly trained teams, often no more than a dozen men, would move under cover of darkness, utilizing local knowledge and camouflaged positions. Their equipment was minimal. MP-40 submachine guns, Kar-98K rifles, and a surprising number of captured American M1 Garands, along with a limited supply of Panzerfausts. The targets were carefully selected. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and the ubiquitous American Jeep, often carrying intelligence officers or communication specialists, became prime objectives. The loss of a single Jeep, while seemingly minor, could sever critical communication links or deprive a forward unit of its eyes and ears for hours, even days. Damage reports from the 28th Infantry Division showed a 40% increase in vehicle losses due to ambush in a 2-week period during late September, a significant portion of which were light reconnaissance vehicles. The psychological impact on drivers and patrol leaders was profound. The constant threat of unseen attack eroded morale more effectively than a frontal assault. This shift in German tactics, from conventional defense to a more agile, asymmetric approach, indicated a profound adaptation. Facing overwhelming material superiority, they sought to exploit weaknesses in the Allied logistical chain and the perceived invulnerability of their rear areas. The Jeeps, once symbols of American mobility and technological advantage, became targets of opportunity. Their very utility turned against their owners. Normandy, July 1944. The American advance inland, initially a surge of armored columns and infantry, began to encounter a peculiar, almost spectral resistance. A resistance that defied conventional military doctrine and the established expectations of a frontline engagement. Reconnaissance units, spearheading the movement, were the first to feel its insidious presence, a creeping attrition that seemed to materialize from the very hedgerows and farmhouses they were tasked with observing. The initial encounters were often dismissed as isolated banditry or the desperate acts of stragglers. Damage reports from the 3rd Armored Division's 36th Armored Infantry Regiment, for instance, first logged instances of vehicle sabotage, not through direct combat, but through expertly placed charges or the removal of critical components during overnight halts. A Jeep from A Company, left secured behind a barn, was found with its distributor cap removed and ignition wires cleanly severed, an act requiring intimate mechanical knowledge and precise execution. Unit diaries from the 9th Infantry Division's 60th Infantry Regiment repeatedly noted the disappearance of supplies from supposedly secure depots, not in bulk, but in small, targeted quantities, ammunition crates, medical kits, and, most tellingly, rations. These were not the haphazard thefts of opportunists. The pilfered items often corresponded to specific, immediate needs, suggesting an intelligence network far more sophisticated than simple opportunism. The total weight of supplies reported missing from a single divisional supply point in a 3-day period in late July exceeded 2,000 pounds. A figure that began to raise alarm. The enemy, it became clear, was not always uniformed, nor did it engage in direct fire unless absolutely necessary. Instead, it operated within the civilian population, leveraging local knowledge and the dense compartmentalized terrain of the bocage. Interrogation files from captured German soldiers, particularly those from static defense units, contained consistent references to Maquis activity and terrorist cells, terms often used with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect, reflecting a persistent, low-level threat to their own rear echelons. This shadow war began to erode American confidence in areas presumed pacified. A patrol from the 4th Infantry Division, moving through a village previously declared clear, found itself ambushed by small arms fire from what appeared to be local civilians, resulting in 3 casualties and the loss of a half-track to an improvised explosive device. The incident forced a reevaluation of tactics, shifting from rapid advance to more cautious, methodical sweeps, often involving house-to-house searches that slowed the overall operational tempo. The psychological impact was profound. The clear lines of engagement, the identifiable enemy, and the predictable patterns of warfare, which American units had trained for and largely encountered in the initial days of the invasion, began to blur. The enemy could be anyone, anywhere, and the constant vigilance required to counter this ubiquitous threat placed an immense strain on morale and resources. The operational consequences were measurable. The average daily advance rate for American armored divisions, which had been 15 to 20 miles in the first week post-D-Day, dropped to an average of 3 to 5 miles by mid-July, partly due to terrain, but increasingly attributed to the necessity of securing flanks and rear areas from this unseen adversary. The deployment of dedicated counterinsurgency patrols, diverting combat assets from the main thrust, became a necessary, if frustrating, adaptation. The initial amusement at the old Panzergrenadiers and their perceived lack of tactical flexibility faded as the American forces confronted an enemy that understood the land and its people with an intimacy that mechanized warfare could not easily overcome. The loss of a jeep, initially a minor inconvenience, became a symbol of a deeper vulnerability, a persistent reminder that the war was not just fought on the battlefield, but in the shadows and the minds of men. The persistent attrition, initially dismissed as mere nuisance, began to manifest as a tangible drain on operational capacity. Damage reports from the 2nd and 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadrons, compiled in late September, indicated a 48% reduction in available light vehicles over a 6-week period. This figure did not include vehicles rendered temporarily inoperable by sabotage or minor damage, only those requiring extensive workshop time or replacement. Supply requisitions for spare parts, particularly tires, fuel pumps, and ignition components, surged by 150% above projected consumption rates for units operating in relatively static defensive lines. The quartermaster records showed a steady depletion of reserve stocks for these specific items, forcing procurement officers to issue urgent requests up the logistical chain. The delays inherent in this process meant that many units operated with a reduced vehicle complement for days or even weeks. Unit diaries and after-action reports began to reflect a shift in tone, from initial bravado to a growing undercurrent of frustration and anxiety. Entries from platoon leaders frequently noted the difficulty in maintaining patrol schedules with fewer jeeps, increasing the workload on the remaining vehicles and their crews. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate loss of equipment. The constant vulnerability fostered a sense of unease, eroding the perceived security of rear areas. The cumulative effect on morale was subtle but pervasive. Interrogation files from captured German Fallschirmjäger and Panzergrenadier soldiers revealed a consistent narrative. The American troops, once confident and seemingly invulnerable, now exhibited a noticeable degree of caution. One captured Obergefreiter remarked, "They looked over their shoulders more often." This shift in demeanor, though not quantifiable in material terms, suggested a successful erosion of the psychological edge previously held by the Allied reconnaissance elements. Logistical planners, reviewing the unexpected expenditure rates, began to reevaluate the threat posed by these dispersed, low-intensity operations. The cost in man-hours for repairs, the increased demand on supply lines, and the intangible impact on combat readiness were becoming undeniable factors in the broader strategic calculus. The small, almost imperceptible losses, when aggregated, presented a significant and growing problem that demanded a response beyond simple replacement. The American reconnaissance units, initially confident in their technological and numerical superiority, slowly began to grasp the enduring effectiveness of their adversaries. The old Panzergrenadiers, often dismissed as remnants of a shattered force, demonstrated a tactical flexibility born from years of combat and a deep understanding of the terrain. Their ability to adapt, even in continuous retreat, confounded the standard operating procedures of the advancing Allied forces. Interrogation files from captured German soldiers consistently revealed a shared philosophy: the preservation of combat power through fluid movement and opportunistic engagement. They understood that direct confrontation against overwhelming firepower was suicidal, but that harassment and disruption could buy precious time. This strategic patience, honed through years of desperate defense, was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated response to an unfavorable strategic landscape. The loss rates of American light vehicles, particularly jeeps and armored cars, became a stark quantitative measure of this effectiveness. After the initial encounters, where reconnaissance elements reported engagements with what they characterized as ragtag German units, subsequent damage reports showed a consistent pattern of targeted attacks on logistics and communication assets. A consolidated intelligence summary for the 3rd Armored Division noted a 28% attrition rate for forward reconnaissance vehicles over a 3-week period in September 1944, a figure significantly higher than projected for a retreating enemy. This attrition was not primarily due to frontal assaults, but to expertly executed ambushes and infiltration tactics. The German infantry, often dismounted and operating in small, decentralized groups, exploited the dense hedgerows and wooded areas to negate the American advantage in vehicle mobility. They understood the vulnerabilities of the lightly armored jeeps and the predictable routes of supply convoys, turning seemingly innocuous rural roads into deadly choke points. The psychological impact on the American reconnaissance troops was considerable. The initial